Welcome back, our dear viewers, and you are still with Nile Cruise on Nile TV. And now we come with our first segment of the program today, and our dear special guest. We have, first of all, it'll be Dr.
She's a lawyer and a member of the National Council for Human Rights.
The head of the Egypt's Council for Human Rights, the NCIR, Mohammed Faye, met with the Minister of Interior, Magdi Abdel Ghaffar, to discuss a number of issues related to human rights and to hand over their annual report. And Mohammed Faye had given earlier the report to President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and the Council's annual report covered the period from the 30th of June 2013 to December 2014. And Faye also discussed with Abdel Ghaffar suggestions sent by the Council to the government's High Legislative Reform Committee regarding the prisons law. So we'll be talking a lot more about this and in more detail with our guest, Dr. Munaz Al-Fakkar. Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining us and making the time for Nile Cruise. Thank you so much. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you very much for joining us. And let's start first with the annual report and what aspects or issues it is mainly focusing on or covering.
The annual report of the National Council for Human Rights is an independent report, and it is different from the usual reports submitted by non-governmental organizations, human rights organizations, in that it is more, first of all, it is a mirror of what has gone wrong and what has gone right. Second, a proactive report that in fact submits real recommendations together with continuous advocacy by the Council to make those recommendations come true. So for example, during the 18 months covered by this report, we have reported on certain positive achievements that we have managed to advocate and to get the government to implement, such as amendment to the regulations of prisons. Mm-hmm. Because all the time, you know, during the transition period, you don't have a parliament, and we have been requesting issue of a new law or a major amendment to the prison law to modernize it, to introduce institutional reform, and to really change the philosophy of the prisons, because we perceive that the prisons are there as an instrument not just for penalization but for reform, for rehabilitation, for you don't want citizens to come in and come out more inclined, either the same or more inclined to be criminals, or to be terrorists, or to be, you want them to come out and have a real opportunity to become good citizens. So I mean, we have been, and also we need to make sure that all the human rights of the citizens are respected, and that the prisons provide, if you like, a bridge between the past and the future, and not more of the same, you know, just so what we have been able to do is change the regulations, because those are issued by ministerial decree. So we lobbied with the Ministry of Interior and we changed the regulations, in fact, and now we are following up to make sure that the new regulations are being implemented.
So you actually managed to change them, Doctor? Like, yes. Can you give us an example of a few things that you managed to change?
So you have a lot of, we worked with them. Instead of sort of fighting with them, we criticize them, we issue reports when violations are made by the police, but we also encourage them to do, you know, what we think is right, and they have shown cooperation, and we did amend the regulations. So now prisoners can have medical treatment in hospitals very quickly, just by a medical report. In the past, you needed to get public prosecution permission.
So it was difficult.
The hours of breaks and sports have been increased.
Have been amended. And
they have a minimum pay for whatever work they do as prisoners. We made sure that they have better space, better oxygen,
Better
air, better
circumstances
food,
and the way
yeah.
the quality of their life inside has been improved a little bit.
Exactly. So now we need to make sure that this is happening in all prisons, because you often
and being followed up.
You often change black and white ink, and it never becomes real life for people.
Of course.
And this is now but now we have discovered through this process that it is not enough. We need to go and change the old law that was passed, decades ago, to modernize it and to introduce those basic principles in the philosophy of the law itself.
So if I can, sort of summarize what I've from you today, it is a process. It's a process that is probably like a feedback process. So you identify the issue, you start raising the topic and discussing with the authorities and the government on this topic. Then you change and formulate maybe laws and reforms, and then you support in making sure that it is implemented and it's part of the culture. And the feedback process goes back to that. So
yeah, very, very true. We also receive complaints from private citizens, from prisoners, from their families, and we investigate those complaints, and we make sure that they are addressed by the competent authorities. So this is another way of using the complaints to develop solutions, not just for that individual or this family, but for the Egyptians at large. For example, we have addressed the cases of torture. I mean, we have received complaints and have investigated certain cases of torture, either in prisons or in police stations, and we have investigated. We have actually decided to, according to the new constitution, we have the right as a council to join forces with the families or the plaintiffs for damages before the courts, and we have in fact decided to do that in 1 or 2 cases, and this is part of the activity to put pressure to change those kinds of situations and to change the culture, and to also provide an environment that would not permit those kinds of violations. You have another issue that is very important. The new constitution has introduced a leap forward with respect to human rights, and you need to implement the constitution through amending the existing laws and issuing new laws. This is part of our ongoing effort to address this and to try and bridge the gap so that our laws become consistent with the constitution in terms of protecting freedoms, in terms of guaranteeing human rights for all citizens without discrimination and so on. So this is another continuous struggle.
No doubt there is development and advancement in terms of placing the laws. Do you think the same is happening in terms of implementing those laws or reforms?
Actually, the fight is always twofold. You fight to change the law,
and then you fight
to implement it.
Exactly.
It does not happen automatically.
But that's the bigger fight, because
I think it's challenging.
And implementing the law, especially when it comes to the police forces, it is not easy.
That is why, in my humble opinion, I say institutional reform is first priority.
Yes.
So, for example, if you look at the justice conundrum, you look at it in a broad way. It starts by the police investigation, then it goes on to the public prosecution, and if the public prosecution decides that there is an accused, they prosecute. You go to the court system, you have the court administrative system, you have the judges, you have the lawyers, you have the court experts, and then you go back to the police for enforcement of the judgment in order to enforce the law. All this, process involves different institutions and different laws and different services provided to us as Egyptians so that we can avail of justice. which is the single most valuable principle for any human being, let alone for any Egyptian. I mean, if we make sure that justice prevails, a lot of our will disappear. So all those, this is institutional reform. And to do that, you need to modernize the laws, to reduce red tape, to cut on procedures. You need to train the police forces, to train and upgrade the skills of the judiciary, of the lawyers, of the court experts, of court clerks.
The entire
system.
This is institutional reform. And this is the real challenge.
Of course.
Yes. And this needs years. It cannot happen overnight.
Yeah, it cannot happen overnight, but you know, this government that we have, this president that we have elected said that we need to leap forward. We cannot walk, we must leap, because we have to...
We have a lot to catch up on.
Exactly. We have to catch up, and this is why
Yeah.
you need radical reforms. Radical and fast-track reforms. And this brings me to one of my favorite topics on institutional reform, which is the civil service law.
We're going to be talking about it actually, Dr. Mona, we're going to be discussing it. But before that, can I also ask you, in a country now in Egypt, we're suffering from terrorism at the moment. Usually, of course, with terrorism, it's very difficult to protect human rights, I would imagine. What is your insight? How are you handling this?
This is a worldwide challenge and a threat, because now in the human rights community, internationally, regionally, and locally, it is a challenge. How do you fight terrorism and protect human rights at the same time?
Yeah.
Because normally when you fight terrorism, terrorists exceed all, they have no limits. They kill out of the law, you know, and they prosecute their own victims, they kill them, they kill innocent people, civilians, military, police.
But there's also one thing from a human rights aspect, which is the definition of terrorism and the boundaries of terrorism, because some people may confuse with criminal acts with terrorism, which is two totally different things.
Exactly, but luckily in Egypt, I don't know if it's luckily or our unfortunate history during the past 30 years, we have faced early on, before the whole world, because you remember that President Sadat was assassinated in 1981. That was our September 11th. So we had to face during the 80s and during the 90s, especially during the 90s, terrorism really at its best in Egypt. And so we issued early on provisions of law in our penal code, criminal code, defining terrorism, terrorist acts, and penalizing and providing for certain procedures. But the problem is it was much easier to put the whole country under an emergency law, and rather than implement those provisions that we introduced in the 90s to our penal code. And this, for 30 years, during Mubarak, we had a state of emergency. Now this is over, and the new constitution provides that you cannot have a state of emergency for more than 3 months, extended by 3 months, and that's it. And it must be by parliamentary approval. So I mean, no more excesses. But you have now to develop a culture of respecting the law and implementing the law by everybody, because during those 30 years, your police, your security forces had the access to emergency powers and emergency authorities. So this is another challenge. And this is institutional reform. But back to terrorism and human rights, it is a challenge to the whole world. You face terrorism, you face killers, killers based on ideology, and not killers, not criminals, as Salma was just saying. They are ideologically tailored to not to respect the law, to hate other people who oppose them, to consider them infidels or apostates, and to justify killing them in cold blood. I mean, this is it. So how do you face this? You have to face it, of course, by
So
the
if you don't
law.
mind, we will definitely cover this, the way to face it, but let's just take a very short break and
And we'll
return
be
with
right
you,
back
Dr.
with
Mona.
Dr. Mona Zafar.